Enjoy it while you can, because you've just lost everything.
Adrian Sterling leaned into the microphone at the Meridian Grand Ballroom and smiled the way only men with too much money and too little conscience can smile. Wide, easy, like the whole room owed him something. "To the future," he said, lifting his champagne glass. And then, without missing a beat, without lowering his voice even slightly, he turned to the man beside him and said, "Make sure Vivian gets the penthouse suite tonight. The usual arrangement." He said it the way you'd order room service. Clara was standing 4 feet away. She heard every word. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply reached down, slid the diamond ring off her finger, set it quietly on the white linen tablecloth, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning of the Meridian Gala, Clara Voss woke up at 5:43 because the alarm on her phone went off and because Adrian had stolen all the blankets again in his sleep. That detail, the blankets, was the kind of thing she'd stopped mentioning years ago. She'd stopped mentioning a lot of things. She lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light of their Upper East Side penthouse, staring at the ceiling. 2,200 square feet of custom plaster molding and hand-sourced marble, and she still felt like she was living inside someone else's house. She supposed, in most of the ways that counted, she was. Adrian was already on his phone. He'd been on his phone since 4:30. She could tell from the way the blue light had been cutting into her sleep for over an hour before the alarm. He didn't say good morning. He never said good morning anymore, not the way he used to. Not the casual, half-asleep kind that actually meant something. Now it was just business. Everything was business. "Move the call with Hargrove to 8, he said into the phone, pulling himself out of bed without looking at her. "And tell Reeves I need the deck revised before noon. The numbers on slide 14 are wrong." He disappeared into his bathroom and closed the door. Clara sat up slowly. She looked at the window. The city outside was still bruised with early morning dark, lights from other towers blinking like they were trying to signal something. She'd grown up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house where the windows looked out onto a neighbor's fence. She'd never imagined she'd end up here. She'd never imagined a lot of things. She got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen island reading a book she'd started 3 weeks ago and kept losing her place in because life kept interrupting. She was 41 years old. She had a master's degree in information science and had spent 8 years as a research librarian before she married Adrian, a fact he found useful exactly once, at a dinner party, when he wanted to impress a professor from Columbia. "My wife has this incredible mind for research," he'd said, and she'd smiled and said nothing. And later that night, driving home, he'd told her she'd seemed distracted and could she try to look more engaged next time. That had been 4 years ago. The marriage had not always been a cold war. There were good years in the beginning, 2 of them, maybe 2.5, where she genuinely believed they were building something. Adrian had been different then, or at least he'd showed her a version of himself that could be warm, that listened, that remembered small things. He'd shown up to her library fundraiser with flowers once. He'd cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings, badly, burning the toast, making her laugh. She'd married that man. The man who stood in her kitchen now, 15 minutes later, reviewing PowerPoint slides over coffee and not once looking up, was someone else entirely. "I need you to be at the venue by 6 tonight, he said, eyes still on his tablet. "Margot will have the dress sent over by 4. Don't wear your hair up. I don't like it up." Clara looked at him over the rim of her coffee mug. "Good morning to you, too." He glanced up briefly. Something crossed his face. Not guilt, just mild irritation at having been interrupted. "I'm serious about the hair. The photographers tonight, I need us to look—" He made a vague gesture with his hand. "You know." "Cohesive," she said. "Yeah, that." She went back to her book. The Meridian Gala was the single biggest event in the social calendar of New York's technology sector that year. Adrian's company, Sterling Apex, was 3 weeks away from its most significant product launch in its 12-year history, a financial technology platform called NextBridge that promised to reshape how global investment banks handled real-time risk assessment. The kind of thing that made venture capitalists sweat with excitement. The kind of thing that made congressional committees nervous. The kind of thing that made Adrian Sterling feel, more than ever, like a man who had escaped the ordinary gravitational pull of consequence. He'd built Sterling Apex in his early 30s on a combination of genuine talent and borrowed credit. Mostly the latter, though he'd spent a decade making sure that version of history was the only one anyone could find. The company's early technical architecture, the code that made NextBridge possible, had come from a collaboration, a partnership really, between Adrian and a small team, including Clara herself, who'd spent 2 years building the algorithmic research framework that underpinned the whole system. She hadn't been a programmer, but she had been, as Adrian once said privately and never publicly, the only one who could see the whole map. She'd designed the research methodology. She'd identified the critical gaps. She'd written the foundational brief that guided the entire technical build. Her name appeared nowhere in the company's public history. Adrian called that the nature of business. Clara had called it something else for a while, argued about it, demanded credit, threatened to walk. And then, gradually, she'd gone quiet. Not because she'd accepted it, because she'd started thinking on. By 6:15, Clara was at the Meridian Grand, standing in a room full of people who knew exactly who she was, and none of them had any idea who she actually was. That was the strange thing about these events. Everyone knew her face. The polished version, the wife version, Clara Sterling, who wore good dresses and smiled at cameras and never said anything sharp in public. But the woman underneath that dress, the one who had spent the last 9 months quietly, methodically, carefully building something, that woman was invisible to every single person in that room, which was exactly how she needed it. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned herself near the east wall, where she had a clear sightline to the main entrance, the bar, and the table where she knew Adrian would spend most of the evening holding court. He arrived at 6:40 with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted his own story, and she watched him work the room the way she'd watched him do it 100 times. The handshake that turned into a shoulder grip, the eye contact held just one beat longer than necessary to make people feel chosen, the laugh that arrived exactly on cue. He was very good at it. She'd never pretended otherwise. Vivian Park arrived at 7:15. Clara had known about Vivian for 8 months. Not suspected, known. She knew the hotel they used, a boutique property in Midtown she'd traced through a recurring charge on a company card that didn't match any vendor in the books. She knew the frequency, twice a month, sometimes 3 times. She knew Vivian was 34, worked as a senior marketing consultant, had met Adrian at a conference in Singapore 2 years ago, and believed, or at least told herself, that the situation was uncomplicated. Clara didn't know what Vivian had been told about the state of the marriage. She suspected she'd been told it was over and everything but paperwork. She watched Vivian cross the room toward Adrian and watched the way his posture shifted slightly when he saw her, the small, involuntary thing that happened to people when they saw someone they actually wanted to see. She had not seen that shift when he'd seen her earlier. She looked down at the ring on her finger. She'd put it on that morning by habit. She'd been putting it on by habit for years. Quote, "Mrs. Sterling!" Margot Chen appeared beside her, Adrian's executive assistant, young, efficient, perpetually worried about everything in the way people are when they work for men who make worry into a job requirement. "Your husband is about to go into the pre-dinner meeting with the Hargrove group. He asked me to make sure you were seated at table 3 before 8 o'clock. "Of course he did," Clara said pleasantly. Margot smiled with professional neutrality, and Clara felt a small, sharp pang of something, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. Margot didn't know. Margot was just doing her job. "Tell him I'll be there," Clara said. She didn't go to table 3. Instead, she found a quieter corner of the cocktail hour near the string quartet, and she took out her phone, and she sent a single message to a contact saved under the name MR. The message said only, "Tonight is still on. All parts confirmed. Be ready at midnight." She put her phone back in her clutch and finished her sparkling water. The dinner itself was the usual performance. 8 courses, a Michelin-starred kitchen, conversation at her table that rotated between tech valuations, summer homes in Montauk, and a lengthy debate about whether a particular golf club in Connecticut had unfairly denied a membership application. Clara contributed exactly as much as was expected of her, and not one syllable more. Adrian gave his pre-speech remarks at 9:30. He was good at speeches the way he was good at everything that involved a room watching him. He talked about innovation, about disruption, about building the infrastructure of the future. He thanked his team, generically, warmly, in that way that didn't require him to name anyone specifically. He thanked his investors. He thanked the incredible support network around him without looking at Clara once. Afterward, he came to find her at the table, which surprised her. He leaned down close to her ear. "Good. You look right tonight," he said. "That dress is working." "Thank you," she said. "It was my choice, not Margot's." He pulled back and looked at her with mild surprise, like he'd forgotten she was capable of choosing things. Then he smiled, already moving on. "Come find me after the dessert course. The Hargrove people want a photo." She watched him walk away. She thought, "This is the last time I will sit at one of your tables." At 10:50, she was standing near the bar when she overheard Adrian speaking to Donovan Reeves, his CFO, a man she'd never trusted, a man who wore his loyalty to Adrian the way other people wore cologne, heavily and without apology. They were standing on the other side of a column, not quite hidden, but apparently unconcerned about being overheard. "Vivian wants to know when you're telling her," Reeves said. "Telling her what?" Adrian said, and from the flatness in his voice, Clara could tell he already knew the answer and was making Reeves say it anyway. "About the Cayman restructure. She's got money in the secondary account and she's asking questions." A pause. Ice shifting in a glass. "She doesn't need to know about the Cayman restructure," Adrian said. "Nobody needs to know about the Cayman restructure. That's why it's in the Cayman Islands, Don. She's not going to stay quiet indefinitely. Vivian is smart enough to understand that asking the wrong questions costs more than not asking them." Another pause. "And if she isn't, you can remind her." Clara did not move from where she was standing. She looked at the bartender, who looked at her, and she said quietly, "Do you have still water?" And he said yes and poured her a glass, and she stood there holding it, and her heart was beating very steadily, the way a clock beats, the way something mechanical and decided beats. She'd known about the Cayman accounts. She'd known for 6 months. But hearing him say it like that, hearing the casual, practiced contempt in his voice, hearing him talk about making Vivian afraid the same way he'd once made Clara feel small, something locked into place that had been almost locked for a long time. She set her water glass on the bar. She walked back to her table. She sat down. She waited through the dessert course, through the coffee service, through the small orchestra that replaced the string quartet, and began playing something that the crowd pretended to enjoy. And then Adrian Sterling, billionaire, tech mogul, man of the year for 3 years running, leaned toward the colleague beside him and told him to arrange the penthouse for Vivian tonight. In exactly that tone, 4 feet away from his wife. And Clara reached for her ring, and she took it off, and she set it on the white linen, and she stood up from that table and walked across the ballroom floor toward the exit. Nobody stopped her. A few people glanced at her. Most didn't. She walked through the lobby of the Meridian Grand, past the coat check, through the revolving door, and out into the November air of Fifth Avenue. And she did not look back at the building, and she did not cry. A black town car was waiting at the curb. The driver didn't ask where she was going. He already knew. She'd met Marcus Riley 14 months ago at what she'd described to Adrian as a library fundraiser, which was technically true. Marcus ran a small financial forensics consultancy that worked primarily with federal whistleblower cases, and he'd been there to speak on research methodology. She'd introduced herself after his talk, and they'd had a 20-minute conversation about document authentication that had turned gradually and carefully into something else entirely. "How long have you been thinking about this?" he'd asked her, in their third meeting, at a coffee shop in Brooklyn she'd traveled to specifically because no one Adrian knew would ever set foot there. "Longer than I've been doing anything about it," she'd said. Marcus was 47, had the kind of face that looked like it had spent time outdoors doing hard things, and had absolutely no interest in being charmed or impressed by anyone. He'd worked with the FBI on 2 financial fraud cases, with the SEC on 3 more. He did not find Adrian Sterling particularly remarkable, which was itself remarkable to Clara, who'd spent so long inside Adrian's gravitational field that it had started to seem like the natural condition of the universe. "He's not that unusual," Marcus had said once, reviewing the financial documents she'd brought him. "The architecture's messier than average, but the instinct is the same. Men like this think the paperwork is the vulnerability. It's not. The people around them are." "Because people talk," she'd said. "Because people get tired," he'd said, "and eventually they want out. And that's when they start looking for a door." Clara had been quiet for a moment. "I've been inside this for 11 years, she'd said. "I know where every door is." The town car took her to a hotel in Chelsea, not a grand one, a clean and unremarkable one, where she'd checked in under her maiden name 3 weeks ago and left a bag in the room containing everything she would need for what came next. A change of clothes, a laptop with a VPN, and a series of encrypted folders, a prepaid phone with 3 contacts saved in it, and a manila envelope that had taken her 9 months to assemble, containing financial records, communications, account documentation, and a USB drive with 47 audio files. She changed out of the gala dress in the hotel bathroom, hanging it carefully on the back of the door, because she was still, even now, someone who hung up her clothes rather than dropping them on the floor. She pulled on dark jeans and a gray sweater and flat shoes and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She did not look particularly powerful. She looked like a tired woman in her 40s who'd just come from somewhere formal. That was fine. She'd spent years understanding that what people see and what's actually true are very different things, and that the gap between those two realities is where all the most important work gets done. She sat down at the desk, opened the laptop, and sent 3 emails, each to a different recipient, each containing a different set of attachments pulled from the encrypted folder. Then she picked up the prepaid phone and called the first number. It rang twice. A voice she knew answered. "You're out?" the voice said. "I'm out," she said. "How are we looking?" The federal contact confirmed this afternoon. "If your documentation is what you say it is, and I've reviewed enough of it to believe it is, we're looking at wire fraud, securities manipulation, and at least 2 violations of the Bank Secrecy Act. That's before we get to the offshore structuring." "It's what I say it is," she said. A pause. "Then we're looking at the end of Sterling Apex." She looked at her reflection in the dark window across from the desk. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, roaring quietly, existing at its own furious pace, indifferent to any individual's crisis or triumph. "Good," she said. She stayed on the phone for 20 more minutes, going through timelines, confirming steps, making sure the pieces that had been arranged over the past several months were still in place and ready to move. And when she hung up, she made herself a cup of the bad hotel room coffee, sat back in the chair, and let herself feel, for just a moment before the practical brain took over again, the strange, dizzying combination of grief and something else that she'd been carrying for so long, she'd almost stopped being able to separate the weight of it from the weight of herself. She was not free yet. That was the thing people got wrong about endings. They thought the decision was the freedom. The decision was just the beginning of the work. But she was out of that ballroom. She was out of that dress. She was sitting in a room that Adrian Sterling did not know existed, and she had built something while he wasn't watching, and it was already in motion, and by the time the sun came up over this city that had never quite felt like hers, the ground under his empire would have begun to shift in ways he didn't have the architecture to understand. She finished the coffee. She set the cup down. She opened the laptop again and started reading through the timeline for the next bridge launch event, which was 14 days away. 14 days was enough time. She'd been patient for 11 years. She could be patient for 14 more days. 3 miles uptown, at the Meridian Grand, someone found the wedding ring on the white linen tablecloth at table 7. They brought it to the event coordinator, who brought it to a senior staff member, who held it up under the chandelier light. It was a remarkable ring. Asher-cut center stone, pave band, the kind of thing that cost more than most people's cars. Whoever had left it deliberately, the way you leave a note, the way you leave a door open. The staff member set it in a small envelope and placed it at the concierge desk to be claimed. It was not claimed that night. The ring sat in a small envelope at the Meridian Grand Concierge desk for 6 hours before anyone thought to tell Adrian Sterling about it. He found out at 4 in the morning. He'd been in the penthouse suite, not the one where Vivian was staying, a different one, his usual when he didn't feel like making the drive back to the apartment, going over revised projections with Donovan Reeves when his phone lit up with a message from Margot. The front desk found Mrs. Sterling's ring. She hasn't been seen since approximately 11 p.m. Should I try calling her? Adrian read the message twice. Then he set the phone face down on the table. Dawn, he said. Reeves looked up from the laptop screen. Yeah. Give me a minute. Reeves closed the laptop and left without asking questions, which was one of the things Adrian paid him well enough to do. Adrian stood at the window of the penthouse suite and looked out at the city, which at 4 in the morning had a particular quality of darkness that felt less like night and more like the world holding its breath. He called Clara's cell phone. It went to voicemail after 2 rings, not 4, which meant she'd declined the call. He called again, same result. He stood there a moment longer, and what he felt was not, if he was being honest, fear. It was irritation, a low, familiar irritation with the particular flavor of something that was going to require his attention at the worst possible time. He sent her a text. Where are you? Call me. He did not say he was worried. He wasn't particularly. Clara didn't make scenes. That was one of the things he'd always relied on. Her fundamental steadiness, her refusal to be dramatic. She'd probably had too much to drink and was at a friend's place and had taken the ring off because her fingers swelled in the cold, which happened sometimes. She'd be back by morning, slightly embarrassed, and they would not discuss it because they'd gotten very good at not discussing things. He went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well, but he told himself later that he had. Clara slept better that night than she had in 2 years. She woke up in the Chelsea hotel room at 7:15 to the sound of the city outside, gray light coming through the gap in the curtains, and she lay still for a moment, taking inventory of how she felt. There was something unfamiliar in it, a kind of spaciousness, like a room after the furniture's been moved out. Not comfortable exactly. Not uncomfortable either. Just different, like the air had more room in it. She showered, ordered coffee and a bagel from the place on the corner that the hotel's lobby flyer recommended, and sat at the desk with her laptop. There were 11 text messages from Adrian. She read them in chronological order, which was its own small portrait of a man. The first 3 were flat and demanding. The 4th had a slightly sharper edge. The 5th and 6th were the ones where he started framing it as her problem rather than his concern. And by the 11th, sent at 6:48 in the morning, it had circled back to something almost neutral. Let me know you're okay. People are asking questions at the office. People at the office. Not him. People at the office. She closed the messages and opened her email. There were responses from 2 of the 3 people she'd contacted the night before. The third, a woman named Diane Chu, who worked as a financial journalist for a publication that had been trying to break a Sterling Apex story for 18 months and kept getting legally stonewalled, hadn't responded yet. But Clara wasn't surprised. Diane was cautious. Diane would want to verify before she replied to anything. The first response was from Marcus. It was brief. Documentation received. My contact at the field office is reviewing. Estimated 72 hours for preliminary assessment. Stay offline on main accounts. You're doing fine. She read, "You're doing fine" twice and felt something small and involuntary happen in her chest. The way you feel when someone says a simple true thing that you didn't know you needed to hear. The second response was from a man named Leonard Hatch, a former Sterling Apex compliance officer who had left the company 14 months ago under circumstances that Adrian had described to the press as a mutual and amicable restructuring. What had actually happened was that Leonard had discovered irregularities in the Nextbridge development accounts. Specifically, money that had moved through 3 subsidiary shells before landing in an offshore structure that bore no relationship to anything in the company's declared financial architecture. And when he'd raised it internally, he'd been given a choice between a very generous severance package with a comprehensive NDA attached and the kind of legal trouble that could follow a man for the rest of his career. Leonard had taken the severance. He'd also, quietly and at considerable personal risk, kept copies of what he'd found. His email to Clara said, "I've been waiting 14 months for someone to ask me the right questions. Tell me what you need." She wrote back, "Start with the NextBridge subsidiary chain, everything you have on the shell structure and the offshore transfers. I need it documented in a way that a federal investigator can follow without needing background in the company's internal accounting system." She hit send. Then she got up, stood at the window with her coffee, and looked at the street below. It was a Tuesday morning in November, and the world was going about its business in the ordinary, slightly grimy way it always did. Delivery trucks, a woman walking a dog that didn't want to be walked, a man arguing on his phone outside a dry cleaner. None of them had any idea that 3 miles uptown, in a tower with her name on the lobby guest registry, the beginning of the end of something was already in motion. She finished the coffee. She pulled on her coat. She had somewhere to be. The offices of Riley Forensic Consulting occupied the 4th floor of a building in Tribeca that also contained a dental practice, a small architecture firm, and inexplicably, a company that appeared to manufacture custom fishing lures. Marcus Riley had never explained the fishing lure company, and Clara had stopped wondering about it. She arrived at 9:15. The receptionist, a young man named Patrick who wore the same rotation of flannel shirts and seemed to exist in a permanent state of mild caffeine deprivation, waved her through to the back conference room. Marcus was already there, along with a woman Clara had met twice before named Soo-Jin Park, who was a former SEC investigator and now worked as an independent compliance analyst. Soo-Jin was 51 years old, kept her hair cut very short, and had a quality of attention that made people feel like they were being read the way a document gets read, carefully, without sentiment, with an eye toward what was missing as much as what was there. "You actually did it," Soo-Jin said when Clara walked in. Not accusatory, more like someone checking the results of an experiment they'd been curious about. "I actually did it," Clara said. "How do you feel?" Clara sat down, pulled off her coat, and considered the question seriously, rather than deflecting it, because Soo-Jin was the kind of person who'd know if you deflected. "Like, I've been holding a very heavy bag for a long time, and I just put it down, but my arms still remember the weight of it." Soo-Jin nodded like that made complete sense, which it probably did to someone who'd spent her career watching people exit situations they should have left years earlier. Marcus set 3 coffees on the table and sat down across from Clara. He had the kind of face that didn't do small talk, which she'd come to appreciate deeply. "Your documentation from last night came through clean," he said. "I've reviewed the offshore transfer records and the secondary account communications. Soo-Jin looked at the shell company filings this morning." "The NextBridge subsidiary chain is a mess," Soo-Jin said, "on purpose. 3 companies registered in Delaware with nominee directors, 2 more in the Caymans, 1 in Malta that's a complete ghost. It's been set up to be difficult to follow, but that doesn't mean it can't be followed. It just means someone has to do the work," Clara said. "Right. And the person who set it up was betting that no one would bother, because no one from inside the company had the full picture and no one from outside had access." Soo-Jin paused. "Except you had both." There was a moment of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, somewhere in the building, something that might have been a drill whirred briefly and stopped. "What's the exposure?" Clara asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "If what Leonard Hatch has corroborates what you've already provided, and based on his email this morning, I think it will. We're looking at wire fraud that crosses jurisdictions, which is a federal matter. The offshore structuring triggers Bank Secrecy Act violations. The securities piece is going to depend on how NextBridge gets characterized. But if we can show the launch valuation is built on financials that have been manipulated, it is," Clara said. "I helped build the research framework for NextBridge. I know exactly what the underlying numbers should look like. What's in the prospectus is not what the underlying numbers look like." Soo-Jin and Marcus exchanged a brief glance. "That makes you a witness," Soo-Jin said carefully, "not just a source." "I know. Adrian's lawyers are going to come after you personally, hard." "I know that too." Another silence. Clara picked up her coffee cup. "I've had 11 years to think about this," she said. "I didn't walk out of that gala and into this room on impulse. If Adrian's legal team wants to argue that I had no meaningful role in the development of NextBridge's foundational architecture, they're welcome to try that in front of a federal judge, and I will bring 47 audio recordings and 800 pages of documentation to that conversation. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Okay? Just that. Just okay." The first sign that something was wrong reached Adrian at 11:40 that same morning. He was in a meeting with the NextBridge launch team, 17 people around a conference table, slide deck on the screen, energy in the room, the buzzing, nervous kind that happens when a large amount of money is about 2 weeks from moving. When Margot knocked on the glass door of the conference room and held up her hand with the fingers spread, which was their signal for there is a problem that cannot wait. He excused himself with a smile that cost him nothing and stepped into the hallway. "What?" he said. Margot was holding her tablet against her chest with both arms, which she did when she was anxious. Someone at the SEC's Division of Enforcement made an inquiry this morning. To our legal department. Adrian was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "What kind of inquiry?" "A records request. Preliminary documentation for a potential investigation into Sterling Apex financial structures." She paused. "Specifically, the NextBridge development accounts." The hallway was climate-controlled to 68 degrees, but Adrian felt briefly and distinctly warm. He looked past Margot at the frosted glass of the conference room where 17 people were waiting for him to come back in and make them feel confident. "Who called our legal team?" he said. "A compliance analyst. External, named Park." He didn't recognize the name. "Get me Reeves and get me Harlan by noon." Harlan was his lead outside counsel. "And don't say anything to anyone in that room." "Of course," Margot said. He went back into the conference room and smiled and continued the meeting and said all the right things in the right order and felt, underneath all of it, the first cold edge of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, still. Not quite. But something adjacent to it, something that had the flavor of standing at the edge of something and not being entirely certain of the ground beneath your feet. He called Clara again at 2 in the afternoon. This time the call didn't even reach voicemail. Her phone was off. He sat in his office with the door closed and thought about that for a moment. Clara's phone was never off. She'd had the same number for 9 years, always reachable, always available in the particular passive way of someone who has learned that not answering costs more than answering. He opened his laptop and pulled up the account dashboard for the joint credit card. Her card hadn't been used since the day before the gala. The last transaction was a coffee shop in Brooklyn 3 weeks ago that he hadn't thought anything of at the time. He sat with that for a moment, then he called Reeves. "She's gone quiet," he said without preamble. "Clara?" "She's gone quiet, and an external compliance analyst named Park made an inquiry to our legal team this morning about the NextBridge accounts." He kept his voice level. He was good at keeping his voice level. "I want to know if those two things are connected." Reeves was quiet for a beat. "That would mean—" "I know what it would mean. Don't tell me what it would mean. Tell me how to find out." "I can pull records on the analyst. See who she's worked with, what cases she's been attached to." Another pause. "Adrian, if she had access to internal documentation and she's been in contact with federal—" "Find out," Adrian said, "and do it quietly." He hung up. He looked at the wall of his office, which was hung with the kind of framed awards and magazine covers that tell a story of a man who has arrived definitively at the place he intended to be. Tech Visionary of the Year, Innovation Summit Keynote, a profile from a business magazine under the headline, "The Man Who Rethought Risk." He thought about the NextBridge accounts. He thought about the Cayman structure. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Reeves at the gala, the one he'd had at the bar behind the column. He thought about Clara standing near the east wall with a glass of water, looking calm. He picked up his phone and scrolled back through the last several months of their interactions with the particular discomfort of someone who has started to suspect they've been reading a situation wrong for a long time. She'd been quieter than usual, yes, but Clara had phases of quiet. He'd always attributed them to her temperament, to the slightly interior quality that had been there since the beginning. He hadn't attributed them to anything deliberate. He should have, maybe. The thought arrived, and he moved quickly past it. the way he'd always moved quickly past thoughts that required him to take responsibility for something. Leonard Hatch spent most of that afternoon at his kitchen table in Hoboken, going through the files he'd kept on a flash drive in a shoebox on the top shelf of his bedroom closet for 14 months. He was 44 years old, had gray coming in at his temples faster than he'd expected, and had not had a good night's sleep since the week he'd signed that NDA and walked out of Sterling Apex with a check and a sick feeling in his stomach that money couldn't quite cover. He'd told his wife, Petra, some of it, not all of it. Enough that she knew why he woke up at 3 a.m. sometimes and went to sit in the kitchen by himself. She'd asked him once, early on, whether he should have done something different. Probably, he'd said. Are you going to? He hadn't known how to answer that then. He was starting to know now. He scanned the documents in batches, account statements, internal memos, an email chain from the NextBridge project lead that referenced the offshore shell transfers in language that was deliberately vague, but to someone who knew what to look for, unmistakably specific. He packaged everything into an encrypted file and uploaded it to the secure transfer portal Marcus Riley had sent him a link to that morning. Then he sat at his kitchen table for a while without doing anything. Petra came in around 5 with groceries and looked at his face and set the bags down on the counter. What happened? She said. I think I'm about to do the thing I should have done 14 months ago. She was quiet for a moment. Does that mean the NDA? Yeah. Leonard, I know what it means legally. Marcus Riley says there are whistleblower protections that likely cover the situation, and the NDA itself may not be enforceable if it was used to conceal federal crimes. He looked at his hands, which were flat on the table. I'm not trying to be a hero. I can't keep living with it. Petra set a hand on his shoulder for a moment, not saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. Then she started putting groceries away, and Leonard got up and poured himself a glass of water, and the two of them moved around the kitchen in the quiet, practiced way of people who have been together long enough to exist alongside each other's serious moments without requiring them to be performed. Is Clara Sterling going to be okay? Petra asked after a while. He thought about it. I think she might be the most okay person in this whole situation, he said. By Wednesday evening, Diane Chu had responded. Her email was 4 sentences. It said, I've been working on the Sterling Apex story for 18 months. Every time we've gotten close, their legal team has filed injunctions and buried us in compliance paperwork. If you have what you say you have, I want to see it, but I want to meet in person. No digital trail. Clara wrote back with a time and a location, a coffee shop in Park Slope that Diane would have to take the subway to get to, which was deliberate, because people who are willing to take the subway to Brooklyn to meet a source are people who are serious about the story. Diane showed up 12 minutes early, which Clara had suspected she would. She was younger than Clara had expected, 37 maybe, with the kind of watchful energy that journalism and insomnia produce in roughly equal parts. She sat down across from Clara, ordered a black coffee, and looked at her with the frank, slightly disconcerting directness of someone who had stopped bothering with social warm-up a long time ago. You're the wife, Diane said. I was the wife, Clara said. What does that make you now? Clara considered the question. Outside the coffee shop window, someone was walking past with a stroller and a look of profound exhaustion. The coffee machine behind the counter hissed. A witness, Clara said. A source. Someone with 9 months of documentation and a very clear picture of how the NextBridge financial structure was built and what it actually contains versus what the public prospectus says it contains. Diane looked at her for a long moment. Not calculating exactly, more like reading. Why now? Why not 6 months ago? A year ago? Because the NextBridge launch is in 13 days, Clara said. And if that launch goes through on the current numbers, there are going to be a lot of smaller investors who put money into something that was built on fraud, and they're going to lose it, and Adrian is going to be in a country without an extradition treaty before anyone figures out what happened. Diane was quiet. I've been building this carefully, Clara continued, because I needed it to be airtight. I needed documentation, corroboration, a federal contact, and a journalist who wouldn't get legally outmaneuvered on day one. I have all 4 of those things now. She slid a folder across the table. That's a summary, not the full documentation. You get that when we have an agreement about how this gets reported and when. Diane opened the folder. She read for 3 minutes without saying anything. A line appeared between her eyebrows that deepened as she read. This is real, she said finally. It was not quite a question. Every page of it. Diane looked up. For the first time since she'd sat down, something shifted in her expression. Not excitement. It was too professional for that. More like the feeling a long-distance runner has when they can finally see the finish line, and it's actually where they expected it to be. When does your federal contact need the full package? She said. 72 hours, Clara said. They're moving on their own timeline, but coordinating with mine. Diane nodded slowly. And what do you need from me? I need the story to break the morning of the Nextbridge launch event, Clara said. Not a leak, not a tease, the whole story. Everything documented, everything corroborated, everything published and live before Adrian Sterling walks into that room. Diane closed the folder. She held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Then she looked at Clara. 13 days, she said. 12, Clara said. I'm not counting today. That night, alone in the Chelsea hotel room, Clara called her sister for the first time in 3 weeks. Her sister, Rachel, lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids, and a life that bore very little resemblance to Clara's, which had always been a source of both relief and a kind of low-grade longing on Clara's part. Relief that Rachel had built something uncomplicated, longing for the thing itself. Rachel picked up on the second ring. I've been waiting for you to call, she said. I know. You did it? I left, Clara said. The rest is in progress. A pause, and Clara could hear in the background the particular ambient sound of Rachel's house. A television, small voices, someone dropping something and saying a muffled word about it. A house with children in it. A house where things fell and got picked up and life continued. Are you scared? Rachel asked. Clara thought about it genuinely. Not in the way I expected to be, she said. It's more like, you know when you've been in a room for so long that you've stopped noticing the smell, and then you step outside and the air hits you and you realize how bad it was in there? Yeah. It's like that. Except the room is also on fire and I lit the match. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are you safe? Right now, tonight, are you physically safe? Yes, Claire said. He doesn't know where I am. Okay? Another pause. Is there anything you need? Clara looked around the hotel room. The desk with the laptop. The cup from the coffee place on the corner. The folder with her handwritten timeline, annotated in the margins in a handwriting so small and precise that Adrian had once said it looked like it belonged to someone who was hiding something. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I think I just needed to hear your voice. They talked for another 40 minutes about nothing urgent, the kind of conversation that exists outside of crisis, and Clara sat on the hotel bed in the dark with the phone pressed to her ear and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely locate, like herself. Not the wife, not the source, not the strategist or the witness or the woman with the 47 audio files and the encrypted folders and the plan that had been building quietly for 9 months while the man who'd dismissed her held champagne glasses and gave speeches about the future. Just Clara, just herself. Outside, the city went on making its noise, indifferent and enormous, the way it always did. Somewhere uptown, Adrian Sterling was awake in his apartment, she suspected, turning things over in his mind, starting to add things up and not quite getting to the right answer yet. He would keep adding. In 12 days, the total would be clear. She turned off the light and lay back on the hotel pillow and closed her eyes. The 12 days passed the way the days before something irreversible always pass. Too slowly at first, then suddenly all at once, like the last inch of rope going through your hands. Adrian felt it, though he wouldn't have named it that way. He'd have called it pressure or noise, or the particular friction that came with a major launch cycle. He was good at reframing things. He'd built a career on it. The SEC inquiry had gone quiet after the initial records request, which his legal team told him was normal procedural behavior and almost certainly nothing to be concerned about. Harlan, his outside counsel, A man who'd been charging $480 an hour for 22 years and had the unflappable quality of someone who'd seen everything twice. Told him the inquiry was likely preliminary screening triggered by a routine audit flag, probably related to the offshore structures that every company their size maintained, probably resolved within 30 days with standard documentation responses. Probably, Adrian had said. In my experience, yes, Harlan had said. Adrian had lived inside the word probably for 12 days and found it an uncomfortable place to be. Clara had not come back. Her phone remained off. Her personal email, the one she'd had since before they were married, showed no activity. He'd had Reeves quietly check the joint accounts, not the ones she controlled independently. He didn't actually know the details of those. He realized now, with a particular sourness, and there had been no unusual movement. She hadn't cleaned out accounts. She hadn't retained a divorce attorney, as far as anyone could determine. She had simply stepped out of the Meridian Grand on a November night and become someone he couldn't locate, which was a thing he had not believed was possible for her. He told people she was visiting family. He told Margot she needed some personal time. He told Vivian, who asked pointed questions in the penthouse suite on 2 separate occasions, that the situation with Clara was complicated in the way all long marriages got complicated, and that it would be handled. You've been saying that for 2 years, Vivian said, one evening 8 days before the launch, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that was different from the usual look she gave him. More settled. More decided. It's more complicated right now, he said. Because she left? Because the timing is bad, he said. The launch is in 8 days, Viv. I need things to be stable right now. And what do I need? She said, not angrily. That was the thing that should have told him something. She said it without anger, which in his experience meant a person had moved past the place where anger was still the primary feeling. You need to give me until after the launch, he said. 2 weeks. That's all I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes that he had found attractive in part because they looked like they could see through things, which he had interpreted as a kind of intelligence rather than, as he should have, a warning. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, and this all changes. She didn't say anything else, and he took that for agreement, which was one of his consistent errors, mistaking silence for consent. Clara spent those 12 days in 3 different locations. The first 4 days she stayed at the Chelsea Hotel, working from the desk, running through documentation with Marcus and Soo Jin, taking calls on the prepaid phone, sleeping in the particular deep way that people sleep when they've made a decision they're no longer second-guessing. She ate bad room service food and went for walks early in the morning before the city got loud, and she talked to Rachel every other day, and she did not check any of the accounts she shared with Adrian because there was nothing in them she needed. After the 4th day, she moved to a sublet in Astoria that Soo Jin had arranged, a 1-bedroom belonging to a colleague who was in Tokyo for 3 months, full of someone else's books and someone else's furniture, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of cardamom, which Clara found oddly comforting. She bought groceries, cooked simple things, sat at the borrowed kitchen table with her laptop and her notes, and built the final version of the documentation package that Marcus's federal contact, a woman named Agent Fran Ellison from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who had the economical manner of someone who'd stopped being surprised by human behavior years ago, would use as the primary source for the arrest warrant application. Agent Ellison had met with Clara once, in person, in a conference room in the federal building in Lower Manhattan. The meeting had lasted 2 hours. Ellison had asked careful, specific questions in a voice that gave nothing away, and Clara had answered each one with the precision she'd spent 11 years developing in the margins. The precision that came from being the kind of person who read everything, remembered everything, and was never once taken seriously in the room. You understand that this process is going to become public, Ellison had said at the end. Your name, your role, your marriage, your involvement in the company, all of it becomes part of the record. I know, Clara said. Some of it is going to be unpleasant. Most of it has been unpleasant for 11 years, Clara said. I'm not particularly afraid of unpleasant anymore. Ellison had looked at her steadily. The warrant application is strong. The offshore structuring alone is sufficient for federal jurisdiction. The securities manipulation piece is going to take longer to fully prosecute, but the wire fraud charges can move quickly. She paused. You've done thorough work, Mrs. Sterling. Ms. Voss, Clara said. I'm using my maiden name. Ellison nodded once and made a note. Ms. Voss, you've done thorough work. Clara accepted the acknowledgement the way she accepted most things these days, directly, without deflecting it into something smaller than it was. 6 days before the launch, Diane Chu published a short, carefully worded piece, not the main story, a preparatory piece, something that read like a financial analysis of the NextBridge launch environment, raising what she called questions about valuation methodology that the publication's legal team had approved as solidly defensible. It was not the story. It was a stone dropped into the water before the full weight arrived. Adrian called his PR director the moment it published. He spent 45 minutes in a meeting with Harlan and 2 additional attorneys. He had the company's communications team draft a response that characterized the piece as speculative financial journalism that fails to account for the robust and fully compliant financial architecture underlying NextBridge. The response went out. Diane posted it on her social media with no comment, which told Clara everything she needed to know about Diane's confidence level. She's ready, Clara told Marcus when she saw it. We're all ready, Marcus said. The question is whether Ellison's team moves on the timeline. Clara called the number she had for Agent Ellison's office. Not Ellison directly, a contact she'd been given for coordination. The contact confirmed. The warrant was signed. The execution was coordinated with the timing of the launch event. The federal team would be in position. Clara put the phone down and sat for a moment at the borrowed kitchen table in Astoria, with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes closed. She thought about all the mornings she'd woken up in the Upper East Side penthouse and felt the blankets gone, and the blue light of Adrian's phone cutting into the dark, and the particular quality of loneliness that comes from being alone inside a life that looks, from the outside, like everything a person could want. She thought about the fundraiser 8 years ago where he'd brought flowers. She thought about the Sunday morning toast burning. She thought about the moment she'd understood clearly and without the possibility of self-deception that the man she'd married was not the man he'd shown her at the beginning, and that the gap between those two men was not something that time was going to close. She opened her eyes. Outside the kitchen window, a pigeon landed on the fire escape, regarded her briefly with its small orange eye, and left. Okay, she said to no one. 12 days had become 0. The NextBridge launch event was held at the Vertex Center, a conference venue in Midtown that Sterling Apex had rented for the occasion. 12,000 square feet of corporate optimism, with 3 screens, a professional lighting rig, assigned seating for 420 guests, and a press area containing 47 journalists, including Diane Chu, who had arrived 40 minutes early and positioned herself in the second row with a laptop, a recorder, and the expression of a person who has been waiting a long time. Leonard Hatch was not in the room. He was in Hoboken, at his kitchen table, with his wife beside him and a lawyer on speakerphone. He'd received a call from Agent Ellison's office the previous day, confirming his cooperation agreement and whistleblower protections. Petra had made him eat breakfast that morning, which he hadn't wanted, but which he'd done because she'd made it and put it in front of him and stood there until he picked up the fork. And then she'd sat down across from him and they'd eaten together without saying very much, because there wasn't much left to say. Clara was not in the Vertex Center either. She was in the Astoria apartment, laptop open, watching a live stream that Diane had arranged through a contact with the venue's media feed. She was wearing the gray sweater from the night she'd left the gala. She had a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her. Marcus was somewhere she didn't know, which was fine. Sujin had texted her at 7 in the morning. Document package fully received by Ellison's office. You're clear. That was the last communication she'd needed. She watched the screen. She waited. The Vertex Center filled steadily from 9:30 onward. Investors, analysts, media, industry contacts, the kind of room that had been carefully curated to reflect maximum confidence in the thing being launched. The atmosphere had the pressed high-energy quality of events that had a lot of money behind them, and the Sterling Apex team had done their job well. The staging was impressive. The materials were polished. The pre-show music struck exactly the right note between corporate authority and accessible optimism. Adrian arrived at the venue at 9:15, which was earlier than his scheduled arrival and earlier than most of his team expected. He came in through the side entrance with Reeves and Harlan and two additional members of his communications staff, and he stood backstage looking at the room, filling through a gap in the curtain with the look of a man checking on something that belongs to him. He looked good, people said later. He looked exactly like Adrian Sterling always looked before a big moment, composed, slightly elevated, the way a flag looks in the right kind of wind. He'd slept, apparently, or at least had the appearance of someone who had slept. He'd had his hair cut the day before. His suit was charcoal, his tie a particular shade of blue that his personal stylist had selected specifically for the camera profile of the venue's screens. Reeves had pulled him aside at 9:40 with an update. The SEC inquiry had generated a follow-up records request that morning, which Harlan was describing as procedural and expected at this stage, and absolutely not a reason to delay the launch. Adrian had looked at Harlan for a long moment. Absolutely not, he'd said. We proceed, Harlan said. Delay now generates exactly the kind of attention we don't want. We launch, we demonstrate confidence, we handle the inquiry through proper channels. Adrian had nodded. He was good at nodding in ways that committed him to nothing. Is there anything else I should know? He said. He'd been asking that question every morning for 12 days. No, Harlan said, which was true from Harlan's perspective, because Harlan didn't know what he didn't know. At 9:58, Adrian Sterling walked out onto the stage of the Vertex Center to the kind of applause that money produces reliably in rooms full of people who have bet on something. He spoke well. He always spoke well. For the first 11 minutes of the presentation, he covered the company's history with the practiced confidence of a man who'd told his own story enough times that it had become the only version, true in the way myths are true, not in the details, but in the self-image they protect. He talked about the decade of development behind NextBridge. He talked about the team. He thanked investors with the warmth of someone who actually felt gratitude, which was the thing that always surprised people about Adrian. He could access genuine emotion when the room required it, could locate something that looked indistinguishable from real feeling and deploy it at the right moment, and you never quite knew whether it was sincere or whether he simply understood that sincerity was the most effective tool available. Clara watched all of it through the laptop screen in Astoria, her cold tea beside her, the borrowed apartment quiet around her. At 11 minutes and 30 seconds into the presentation, the main screen behind Adrian changed. He didn't notice immediately. He was in mid-sentence moving to the next section of the talk, turning partially toward the screen to cue the graphic that was supposed to appear, a data visualization of NextBridge's projected market integration, and what he saw instead stopped him mid-word. The screen showed a spreadsheet, clean columns, formatted rows, dates and figures and account numbers, not an abstract visualization, an actual document, a Sterling Apex internal document, specifically the NextBridge Development Fund Transfer records, showing the movement of $47 million through 3 Delaware shell companies and into a Cayman Islands account registered to a nominee director with a name that appeared in no Sterling Apex corporate filing ever submitted to any regulatory body. The room had been in the process of applauding. The applause died the way sound dies when something interrupts the frequency, not all at once, but in a wave, person by person, as people registered what they were looking at. Adrian's hand went to the earpiece he was wearing. "Cut the feed," he said quietly, which the microphone picked up. The screen did not cut. It advanced automatically to the next document. This one, a series of internal email exchanges between Adrian and Donovan Reeves, time-stamped across 14 months, discussing the Cayman structure in language that was deliberate and careful, but that, in the context of the financial records preceding it, was unmistakably incriminating. The exchange included one line from Adrian that was highlighted in yellow on the screen. The NextBridge numbers in the prospectus don't need to match the development actuals. They need to match what the market needs to see to price this correctly at launch. The room went the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Reeves, standing at the side of the stage, had his phone out. His face had gone a color that was bad in the way medical things are bad. Adrian turned to face the audience. His expression did something complicated. It cycled through several things in the space of about 2 seconds. Disbelief, calculation, the beginnings of the particular controlled fury that was his default response to loss of control. Then it settled. He was, even now, even in this, very good at settling his expression. "There's been a technical," he started. The screen advanced again. This time it showed an audio transcript, formatted, time-stamped, annotated with recording metadata. The transcript was of a conversation between Adrian and a man identified only as Contact K, discussing the movement of funds through Malta and the timing of the next bridge launch relative to the completion of the offshore restructuring. The conversation was dated 8 months ago. At the bottom of the transcript page, in a small text block, was the notation, "Audio recording on file. Federal case reference pending." 420 people were reading a screen that was dismantling everything they'd been told this morning, and Adrian Sterling was standing on a stage in a charcoal suit and a camera-tested blue tie, and for the first time in a very long time, he had nothing to say that would help. He tried anyway. He was fundamentally a man who kept trying. "This is a coordinated attack on this company," he said into the microphone. From the press area, Diane Chu raised her hand, not to ask a question, just to indicate her presence. She'd been writing since the screen changed. Her piece had been drafted and ready for 48 hours. She was waiting only for this moment, this confirmation, this public record. She sent the piece at precisely the moment the doors at the back of the Vertex Center opened. 4 people came through those doors. 2 wore the kind of suits that could belong to anyone. 2 wore the kind of identification that didn't need explanation. They moved through the room with the particular unhurried purposefulness of people who are doing something that cannot be interrupted and that they have done before. The lead agent, a man named Carter who had 15 years in federal financial crimes, walked to the edge of the stage. He had a document in his hand. He said Adrian's name, not Mr. Sterling, just the name, which in itself communicated everything about how the relationship between Adrian Sterling and institutional authority had just changed. "Adrian Sterling, I have a federal arrest warrant for wire fraud, securities manipulation, and violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. I need you to step down from the stage." The room was very still. Adrian looked at the warrant. He looked at the 4 people. He looked at the room of 420 people who were looking at him with expressions that ranged from shock to something that, in several cases, was already shifting toward the careful professional distance people adopt when they need to begin reassessing their association with something. He looked at Reeves, who was no longer at the side of the stage. Reeves had left the building 53 seconds after the screen changed, which Carter's team had anticipated and which 2 additional agents waiting outside had addressed efficiently. Adrian Sterling stepped down from the stage. He did not say anything as Carter placed his hands behind his back and attached the restraints with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this gesture had long since lost its drama. Around him, the Vertex Center was beginning to make the sound of 400 people simultaneously deciding what to do with information they hadn't expected to receive before noon on a Tuesday. Cameras were out. Someone was live streaming. Diane was typing. The screen behind the empty stage still showed the last document, the audio transcript, the annotated timestamp, the federal case reference. And it would stay up for another 4 minutes before someone from the venue's technical team finally reached the control panel and cut the feed. In the Astoria apartment, Clara watched Adrian Sterling walk off the stage between 2 federal agents, and she felt the thing she'd expected to feel, a kind of release, the particular relief of a long-held pressure being resolved. But underneath that, and she hadn't entirely anticipated this, was something else, something harder to name. Not grief exactly. She'd done her grieving already, across 11 years, in small increments, the way you grieve things that die slowly rather than suddenly, but something adjacent to it, the recognition that it was over, not just the plan, not just the 9 months of careful work, but everything. The whole architecture of the life she'd inhabited, the name she'd carried, the penthouse with the stolen blankets and the blue phone light at 4 a.m, the version of herself that had learned to be invisible in a room because being visible cost too much. That was over. She picked up the cold tea, looked at it, set it back down. She called Marcus. He picked up on the first ring. "You watched?" "Yes," she said. "Ellison's team made the arrest cleanly. Reeves is in custody. The warrant covers 3 additional individuals, the Malta company's registered agent and 2 people in the Cayman structure. A pause. It worked, Clara. She looked at the wall of the borrowed apartment, at someone else's bookshelves, someone else's framed print, someone else's small domestic life temporarily housing her larger crisis. I know, she said. How are you doing? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to do everything honestly lately, with herself as much as with anyone. I'm okay, she said. Not great. Okay. That's about right for today, Marcus said. She hung up and sat there in the borrowed quiet, and outside the window the Astoria street was doing its ordinary mid-morning things, and somewhere in Midtown a room full of people were reconstructing their understanding of something they'd thought they knew, and Diane Chu was filing the story that would be the lead in 7 publications by evening, and Leonard Hatch in Hoboken was sitting at his kitchen table with his wife's hand on his arm, hearing the news on his phone, feeling the strange lightness of a weight he'd been carrying starting to lift. And in a holding room in Lower Manhattan, Adrian Sterling was sitting across from a federal agent with his hands flat on a table and a lawyer he'd called in a panic on his way there, beginning to understand, in the specific, slow, unignorable way that understanding comes when there's nowhere left to redirect it, that the woman he'd dismissed, underestimated, and ultimately ignored had not been quiet because she had nothing to say. She'd been quiet because she was listening, and she had heard everything. The story broke at 11:47 in the morning, which meant it hit the East Coast business cycle at precisely the worst possible time for Sterling Apex and the best possible time for everyone who had been waiting to write it. Diane's piece went live first, 12,000 words, fully documented, with embedded images of the financial records, a timeline of the offshore transfers, and 3 separate pull quotes from the audio transcripts that the publication's legal team had cleared the previous afternoon. The headline was clean and specific and left no interpretive room. Sterling Apex CEO, arrested on federal wire fraud and securities charges as next bridge launch collapses. Within 40 minutes, it had been picked up by 4 financial publications, 2 national newspapers, and a wire service that distributed it to 43 additional outlets. By 1 in the afternoon, it was the top trending item on every financial news aggregator that mattered. The Sterling Apex stock price, which had been trading at its highest point in the company's history that morning in anticipation of the launch, dropped 19% in the first hour after trading was halted by the exchange's volatility protocols. When trading resumed, it dropped another 11%. By closing bell, it had shed 42% of its value, and the exchange had flagged it for continued monitoring. In the lobby of the Sterling Apex offices on Park Avenue, which Clara had visited perhaps a dozen times in 11 years, and always felt faintly unwelcome in, the company's communications team spent the afternoon fielding calls they were not equipped to handle. The press director, a man named Gil Avery, who had worked for Adrian for 6 years, and who believed genuinely and without irony in everything he'd been given to believe about Sterling Apex, sat in his office at 2:15 in the afternoon and read Diane's piece in its entirety, and then sat quietly for a while, staring at his computer screen with the look of a man who has just learned that the ground he'd been standing on was a different substance than he'd assumed. He called his wife at 2:30. He said he might be late. She asked why. He said, "It's complicated." She said she'd seen the news. He said he was sorry. She said for what? He didn't have a complete answer for that yet, which was honest of him. Vivian Park found out the way most people found out that day. From her phone, from a notification, from a headline that appeared while she was in the middle of something else entirely. She was at her desk at the marketing consultancy where she worked, reviewing a client presentation, when the notification came through and she clicked it and read the first 3 paragraphs of Diane's piece, and then set her phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. She was not stupid. She had never been stupid, and she'd spent 2 years telling herself that was different from being willfully uninformed, which it was and wasn't, depending on the day. She had known, in the ambient and unexamined way people know things they haven't yet decided to look at directly, that Adrian's relationship with money was not entirely conventional, the questions she'd learned not to ask, the cash that moved through accounts she'd been encouraged not to monitor, the answers that were always slightly too smooth, too immediate, like they'd been prepared in advance. She'd told herself those were the textures of extreme wealth, not the evidence of something else. She told herself that long enough that she'd partly believed it. Her phone buzzed. Adrian's name on the screen. She stared at it. She didn't pick up. It buzzed again, then a text. Viv, call me. This is not what it looks like. She read the text once and then did something she hadn't done in 2 years, which was make a decision about Adrian Sterling without consulting her feelings about him first. She opened the contacts in her phone, scrolled to his name, and deleted it. Not blocked, deleted. Which was a different gesture, more final, less angry. Anger implied you still cared enough to prevent contact. Deletion was something else. She picked up the client presentation she'd been working on. Her hands were steady, which surprised her, and then didn't. She'd been steadier than she'd given herself credit for a long time. She worked until 6. She took the subway home. She made pasta for dinner, eating it standing at her kitchen counter because she lived alone and had never bothered acquiring the habit of setting a table for one. And she watched the evening coverage of the arrest on her laptop while she ate. And she felt several things in succession that were difficult to arrange into a clean narrative. Something that might have been relief, something that was definitely embarrassment, something that was close to grief, but pointed at herself rather than at him. For the 2 years she'd spent in something she'd known, on some level she hadn't wanted to visit, was not what it appeared to be. At 9 o'clock, she called her older sister, who lived in Chicago, and who had met Adrian once and said afterward privately, "He's charming the way salespeople are charming. I'd check his math." Vivian had been annoyed at the time. She was not annoyed now. "You saw," Vivian said when her sister picked up. "I saw," her sister said. "I'm okay," Vivian said, which was partly true and partly the thing you say at the beginning of a process that will take longer than a single evening. "I know you are," her sister said. "You want me to come?" "No. I just wanted to tell you that you were right." A pause. Her sister, to her credit, did not say "I told you so," which was one of the things Vivian had always valued most about her. Instead, she said, "What do you need tonight?" "I think I just need tonight to be tonight," Vivian said, "and tomorrow to be a different day." They talked for an hour. It was not a satisfying conversation in the way resolution is satisfying. It was satisfying in the way that honesty is satisfying, which is a different and more complicated thing. Whoa. Donovan Reeves had been apprehended in the parking structure adjacent to the Vertex Center at 11:23, approximately 47 minutes after he'd left the building. He'd made it as far as his car, which was either evidence of poor escape planning or of the fact that some part of him had always known, on some level, that the exit he'd been preparing for was not one he was actually going to make. He was processed, booked, and in a federal holding facility by 2 in the afternoon. His attorney, not Harlan, his own separate attorney, a woman named Barbara Fenn, who specialized in white-collar defense and whom he had retained, his wife later told investigators 6 months ago, arrived at 4 and spent 90 minutes with him in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and institutional air conditioning. Barbara came out of that meeting with the expression of someone who has just assessed a situation and found it significantly worse than advertised. She called her assistant from the parking garage and said, "Clear my Friday and get me the Ellison contact number from the federal list." Reeves, alone in the holding room after Barbara left, sat with his hands between his knees and thought about a fishing trip he'd taken with his father in Vermont when he was 11 years old. He couldn't have told you why that was the memory that arrived. Maybe because it was the last uncomplicated time he could clearly locate. The lake, the cold air, the fish they didn't catch, his father not being angry about it. Simple things. He'd made 5,200 decisions in 17 years at Sterling Apex that had moved him incrementally away from simple things, and none of those decisions had felt irreversible individually, which was the thing about incremental movement. You never see the distance you've covered until you turn around and look. He didn't sleep well that night. He doubted he was going to sleep well for a while. Harlan Briggs, Adrian's outside counsel, spent the 24 hours after the arrest in continuous professional crisis management mode, which, for a man of his experience and billing rate, meant he was doing what he did best, but doing it in conditions he found genuinely uncomfortable. He filed for a bail hearing, engaged 2 additional attorneys to handle specific components of the case, and had a long and carefully worded phone conversation with the federal prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Caitlin Morse, who had a reputation for not being moved by the kind of peripheral pressure that moved some prosecutors. My client's position is that the financial documentation has been removed from its operational context and mischaracterized by individuals with personal motivations, Harlan told Morse. That's a position your client is welcome to develop at trial, Morse said. We'd like to discuss the possibility of, Mr. Briggs, the wire transfer records are not ambiguous. The email documentation is not ambiguous. The audio recordings your client made without apparently considering where they might end up are not ambiguous. A pause. File what you need to file. We'll see each other in court. Harlan sat with the phone after that call and felt the specific fatigue of a man who has spent 2 decades believing that framing was everything and has just encountered a situation where the facts have become stubbornly resistant to reframing. He called Adrian at the facility where he was being held, pre-bail, and told him the preliminary assessment. How bad? Adrian said. His voice was different, still controlled, still with that quality of holding itself together, but something in the texture had changed. Like a material that's been put under the wrong kind of stress and hasn't broken yet, but you can hear something in it. The wire fraud exposure is significant, Harlan said carefully. The securities piece is going to take longer to develop, but the wire fraud alone, plural counts, with the offshore structuring as supporting evidence. We're talking potential federal sentencing guidelines that are serious. Define serious. Adrian, define it, Harlan. A pause. If convicted on all current counts, guidelines suggest a range in the vicinity of 7 to 12 years. Harlan let that sit for a moment. We will contest every count. We will challenge the documentation's provenance, the chain of custody, the source's credibility. The source, Adrian said quietly. The primary source is, I know who the primary source is. He was quiet for a moment. She did all of this. She was building this the whole time. Harlan didn't answer that because it wasn't a legal question. How long did she have access to the internal systems after she stopped being involved in the business? Adrian said. That's something we're investigating. But Adrian, the documentation she provided predates your marriage in some areas and spans your entire tenure at Sterling Apex in others. Whatever access she had, she used it methodically. Adrian was quiet for a long time. Harlan, who had sat across from powerful men in difficult moments for over 2 decades, did not rush the silence. He'd learned that some silences were where people actually arrived at things, and interrupting them was almost always a mistake. She was always the most organized person I've ever known, Adrian said finally. His voice had something in it that was hard to identify. Not exactly admiration, not exactly bitterness, something in between those things that didn't have a clean name. I thought it was just how she was. I didn't think she was pointed at anything. She was pointed at quite a lot, it turns out, Harlan said. The Sterling Apex Board of Directors held an emergency session at 7 in the evening on the day of the arrest. 7 of the 9 board members participated via video call, and the 2 who didn't had sent written statements through their attorneys that amounted to the same thing. They were distancing themselves from the current leadership situation as expeditiously as possible, which was the corporate equivalent of leaving a dinner party without saying goodbye. The board voted to suspend Adrian Sterling's executive authority pending the outcome of federal proceedings. They appointed an interim CEO, a woman named Patricia Gould, who had been on the board for 3 years and who had, it emerged later, raised questions about the NextBridge financial structure at 2 separate board meetings that had been addressed by Adrian in language that was confident enough to forestall further inquiry. Patricia accepted the appointment with the grim pragmatism of someone who has just been handed a problem they didn't create and will now be responsible for managing. Her first call the following morning was to the SEC to discuss cooperative disclosure. Her second was to Sterling Apex's communications team to begin the process of separating the company's public identity from its founders. Her third was to the company's head of technology to establish exactly how much of NextBridge's actual technical architecture was sound and how much of what had been presented to the market was prospectus fiction. The answer to that third question was complicated, and the complications were, in their way, the most damaging thing for Adrian Sterling's legacy. Because NextBridge, the underlying technology, was not entirely fraudulent. There was real work at its core. The research framework that had guided its development was genuinely innovative. The problem was that the financial structure built around it had been corrupted to serve Adrian's interests rather than the company's. And in the process, the numbers had been distorted to the point where even the legitimate parts were now tainted by association. Patricia Gould looked at her head of technology across the conference table on the second day of her interim tenure and said, "Tell me what's actually real here." The technology head, a quiet man named Dimitri, who had been with the company for 7 years and who had always been faintly uncomfortable with the distance between what he knew NextBridge could do and what the marketing materials said it could do, spread his hands on the table. "The architecture works," he said. "The research methodology it was built on is solid, genuinely solid." "Who built the research methodology?" Dimitri paused. "The founder's wife. Ex-wife, I guess. Clara Voss." Patricia wrote the name down. She underlined it once. Marcus Riley called Clara on the second day to walk her through the early fallout. She was in the Astoria apartment, having moved from the desk to the couch sometime in the previous 24 hours. Her laptop open beside her, cold coffee in her hand, watching the news coverage with the slightly dissociated feeling of someone observing something they know they built, but that has now taken on a life independent of them. "Reeves is cooperating," Marcus said. "Barbara Fenn is a smart attorney, and she's going to get him the best deal available, which means he talks. That adds corroboration to your documentation and strengthens the federal case considerably." "What about the Malta contact, the offshore agent?" "Extradition is a longer process, but Ellison's team has opened the channel. That's going to take months, maybe longer." A pause. "Clara, the board removed Adrian from his executive role last night." She'd seen it in the news, but hearing Marcus say it plainly was different. "Okay," she said. "The company's new interim CEO reached out to my office this morning." Clara sat up slightly. "About what?" "She wants to discuss the NextBridge research framework, specifically its authorship. Apparently her head of technology confirmed what we've known all along. The foundation of the system is your work." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the television screen, which was currently showing the exterior of the federal building where Adrian had been processed, with a chyron running beneath it that included his name and the words "wire fraud" and "securities manipulation" in the flat declarative style that news graphics use for things that would have seemed extraordinary a week ago. "I'm not interested in the company," she said. "I don't want a piece of it. I don't want credit retroactively assigned in some press release. That's not what this was about." "I told her as much," Marcus said. "She still wants to talk. Not about ownership, about the research. She says if there's any path to salvaging what NextBridge could actually be, rather than what Adrian built it into, the framework you developed is the starting point." Clara rubbed the side of her face with her free hand. She was tired in a bone-level way that had been accumulating for a long time, and that wasn't going to resolve quickly. "Tell her I'll think about it," she said. "Not now. Later, after the initial proceedings." "That's fair." "Marcus." She stopped. She'd been about to say something and wasn't entirely sure how to phrase it. "Did we do the right thing?" "Not legally. I know the legal answer, but did we do the right thing?" A pause on his end. She could hear him thinking, which was something she'd come to be able to recognize, a particular quality of silence that wasn't absence but presence. "I've done this work for a long time," he said finally. "Financial fraud cases. Whistleblower situations. I've seen what happens when things like this don't get exposed. Investors who lose everything, employees who built their careers on something that evaporates, the people who saw it and stayed quiet living with that for the rest of their lives." Another pause. "Leonard Hatch slept 8 hours straight the night after the arrest for the first time in 14 months. His wife texted me. That's not the answer to your question exactly, but it's the one I've got." Clara looked at the window. The November light in Astoria was thin and gray and honest, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anything but shows you what's actually there. "Okay," she said. "That's enough of an answer for today." The bail hearing was held 4 days after the arrest. Adrian was granted bail at $2 million, with a passport surrender and travel restrictions. Harlan had argued for lower. Prosecutor Morse had argued for remand, citing flight risk given the offshore financial structures. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Devereaux, who had been on the federal bench for 17 years, set the $2 million figure with the calm efficiency of someone who has made 1,000 such calculations. Adrian's personal financial situation had, in the 4 days since the arrest, become substantially more complicated than it had appeared from the outside. The offshore accounts were frozen as part of the federal proceeding. The Sterling Apex shares, which had constituted a significant portion of his personal net worth, had lost over half their value and been further encumbered by the SEC's emergency action, halting his ability to trade or liquidate his personal position. The Park Avenue apartment was in his name, unencumbered, but his liquid access to assets was constrained in ways that were, for a man who had never in his adult life experienced financial constraint of any kind, deeply disorienting. He paid the bail through a personal line of credit from a private bank that his attorney arranged. He left the federal building in the same charcoal suit, now 4 days old, and got into a car that Harlan had sent and was driven back to the apartment that still had Clara's things in it, her books in the living room, a coat she'd left in the front closet, a coffee mug on the kitchen counter that he found himself unable to move. He sat in the apartment's living room that evening with a glass of whiskey he hadn't poured yet, just held, and looked around at the 2,200 square feet that had always felt like a statement and now felt like a room. Just a room. High ceilings and good light and expensive surfaces and the complete absence of the person who had made it feel inhabited. He could not call her. He did not have a number that worked. Her attorney, she'd retained one, her own, a woman from a firm he didn't know, had sent a formal communication to Harlan indicating that all contact between the parties should be through counsel, which was standard, which was also, somehow, the most concrete evidence yet that the marriage was over in a way that couldn't be attributed to drama or absence or a temporary loss of perspective. He poured the whiskey. He drank some of it. He thought about what he'd said to Harlan. She was always the most organized person I've ever known. He'd meant it as a kind of tribute in the moment. He'd also meant it as a kind of accusation, though he wasn't ready to examine who he was actually accusing. He sat in the living room until late, not watching television, not on his phone, which was unusual for him. He was almost never not on his phone. He just sat with the whiskey and the quiet and the particular quality of an empty apartment that has recently been a home. Well, the story had a secondary set of casualties that the news coverage touched on briefly, but that mattered more to the people involved than the coverage suggested. There were 43 employees at Sterling Apex who had mortgages and car payments, and children in school and retirement accounts that included company stock options that were now worth a fraction of what they'd been told they were worth a week ago. Not all of them were innocent. Some had known or suspected and said nothing, and would carry that. But many of them had simply worked at a company that turned out to be something other than what it appeared, which is a thing that happens to people in the ordinary course of life, and that leaves a specific kind of damage. A woman named Kay Tran, who'd been a senior developer on the NextBridge technical team for 4 years, and who had genuinely believed in the product she was building, drove home the evening of the arrest and sat in her car in the parking garage of her building for 20 minutes before going inside. She had a 6-month-old and a husband who was a teacher, and a life that didn't have a lot of cushion in it for the kind of uncertainty she was now looking at. She called her mother, who was 72 and practical in the way of people who've survived worse. Her mother said, "Is the work you did still good work?" Kay thought about it. "Yeah," she said, "the work is good." "Then the work still exists," her mother said. "The rest is other people's problems." Kay sat in the parking garage a few more minutes. Then she went inside and fed the baby, and when her husband got home she told him everything, and they sat on the couch with the baby between them in the particular imperfect weight of a real life, and they talked about what came next, not because they had answers, but because talking about it was the thing you did. On the 6th day after the arrest, Diane Chu published a follow-up piece. This one was different from the first, less prosecutorial, more considered. It focused on the NextBridge research framework and its origins. It named Clara Voss, carefully and accurately, as the architect of the foundational methodology. It quoted from internal documents, the ones Clara had provided, that showed her work, her fingerprints on the intellectual core of the system, her name absent from every public document and every public credit. The piece was not framed as a triumph. Diane was too good a journalist for that. It was framed as a question: what happens to the work when the person who did it has been made invisible? And what does it mean when that invisibility turns out to have been the thing that saved everyone? Clara read it in the Astoria apartment on a gray morning, sitting at the borrowed kitchen table with actual hot coffee for once. She read it twice. She felt something reading it that was difficult to parse. Not vanity, not pride exactly. More like being seen, which is a different thing and one she'd had very little practice receiving. She forwarded the link to Rachel with a single line: "This one is worth reading." Rachel wrote back 12 minutes later: "I've been telling you for 11 years that you were worth reading." Clara looked at that text for a moment. Then she put her phone down and looked out the kitchen window at the November sky, which was the same flat gray it had been for days, and thought about the thing that comes after the end of something. Not a new beginning, not yet. Those were too neat, too conclusive. Just the strange, uncharted middle space between what was and what would eventually be. She had work to do. Not Adrian's work, not Sterling Apex's work, not the work of revenge or exposure or justice, which were already moving through their own systems at their own pace. Her work, the kind she'd put aside or suppressed or redirected for 11 years, the kind that had been waiting in her with the patience of something that knows its time is coming. She opened her laptop. She made a new folder, named it with her maiden name. She started a document with a blank first page. She sat with the blankness for a moment, which felt right. Not intimidating, just open, just space. Outside, the city made its noise. The borrowed apartment smelled of cardamom and someone else's life. The gray light came through the window clean and flat and honest, the kind that doesn't romanticize anything but shows you exactly what's in front of you, which was enough. It was more than enough. The blank document on Clara's laptop stayed blank for 3 days. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to write. She knew exactly what she wanted to write. She'd known for years, the way you know something you've been carrying around without permission to set down. She had ideas, frameworks, a methodology that she'd developed over a decade of research work that had been absorbed into Adrian's empire without acknowledgement, and was now, technically, the subject of 2 separate legal filings and a published piece of journalism and conversations at a company she wanted nothing to do with. She had all of that. What she didn't have yet in those first days after the arrest was the particular kind of stillness required to begin something that was purely her own. She'd spent so long doing work that belonged to someone else that the prospect of work that belonged only to her had a quality that was almost vertiginous, like stepping off a boat onto ground that's solid but takes a moment for your body to trust. On the 4th day, she started writing. Not the big thing, not yet. She started with something small, a technical essay on algorithmic risk assessment methodology, the kind of thing that would once have been absorbed into a Sterling Apex white paper without her name on it. She wrote it in 5 hours, barely moved from the kitchen table, ate half a granola bar sometime in the early afternoon without noticing she was doing it, and when she finished and sat back and read it through, she felt the thing that good work produces in the person who did it. Not pride exactly, something quieter and more durable than pride. Recognition. Like finding something you'd mislaid and had stopped expecting to find. She sent it to a contact at a financial technology research journal she'd been reading for years. She used her maiden name in the byline. She didn't mention Sterling Apex. She didn't mention Adrian. She just sent the work and went to make actual dinner for herself for the first time in a week, standing at the borrowed stove in the Astoria apartment making pasta with whatever the cupboard had in it, which wasn't much, but it was hers, and she'd cooked it herself, and she ate it at the kitchen table without reading anything or watching anything, just sitting with the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday evening. The journal responded in 6 days. They wanted to publish. They had questions about one section and a request to expand the conclusion. She made the revisions in a single afternoon. It was the first piece of work she'd published under her own name in 11 years. The federal case moved with the methodical, slightly grinding pace that federal cases move at, which is not the pace of television and not the pace that people who are waiting for justice find comfortable, but is the pace of something that is built to be difficult to overturn. Adrian's trial date was set for the following spring, 7 months out. In the interim, the pre-trial proceedings generated a paper record that was, by the time it was fully assembled, several thousand pages long. Harlan filed motions to suppress the audio recordings, arguing improper acquisition. Prosecutor Morse filed responses. The judge ruled on each in turn with a thoroughness that suggested she'd read every page rather than summarizing, which was in itself a kind of message about how she was going to run the case. Donovan Reeves accepted a cooperation agreement in the 8th week. His attorney, Barbara Fenn, had negotiated a deal that reduced his exposure significantly in exchange for full testimony and documentation support. He met with federal investigators on 4 separate occasions and gave them everything: the Cayman structure, the Malta transfers, the conversations with Adrian about the Nextbridge prospectus numbers, the moment he'd understood what was happening and the moment he'd decided to continue anyway, which was a distinction the prosecutors found important and which Reeves himself, sitting in those interview rooms, found more difficult to discuss than the facts alone. "When did you know the prospectus numbers weren't accurate?" the investigator asked him in the 3rd session. Reeves sat with the question. His attorney was beside him. The fluorescent light in the room was the kind that makes everyone look tired. "About 14 months before the launch," he said. "And you continued in your role?" "Yes." "Why?" He'd known the question was coming. He'd thought about the answer for weeks. "Because stopping felt harder than continuing," he said finally, "and because I told myself it was going to get fixed, that Adrian was going to find a way to make the numbers real before it mattered." He paused. "He wasn't going to do that. I knew that. I just didn't let myself know it." The investigator wrote something down. Reeves looked at the table. "I'm not trying to make that sound better than it is," Reeves said. "I know what it is." "Okay," the investigator said, and moved to the next question. Leonard Hatch testified before a federal grand jury in the 3rd month. He'd prepared for weeks with his attorney, going through the documentation, reviewing his own memory of events, sitting with the discomfort of public recounting in a way that was, he found, less terrible than he'd anticipated. Not easy, not comfortable, but bearable, in the way that things you've been dreading often turn out to be bearable once they're actually happening. His wife, Petra, drove him to the federal building on the morning of his testimony. They sat in the car outside for a few minutes before he went in, not saying much. She handed him a coffee from the place he liked, which she'd stopped for on the way. He took it and held it and looked at the building. "You already did the hard part," she said. 14 months ago, when you kept the files. That was the hard part. This is just saying out loud what you already know." He nodded. He was not a man who cried easily, but there was something in his eyes that morning that was close to it. "I should have done it sooner," he said. "Yeah," she said, "but you're doing it now." He went in. He testified for 4 hours. He answered every question directly and without embellishment, which was the only way he knew how to do things when he was operating from conscience rather than self-interest, and which the prosecutor later told his attorney was some of the clearest and most credible grand jury testimony she'd encountered in a case of this complexity. He came out of the building at 2 in the afternoon. Petra was still there, reading in the car, which he'd told her not to wait for, and which he'd known she was going to do anyway. He got in and she looked at his face and said, "How was it?" "Hard," he said. "Also right." She started the car. They drove home over the bridge, the city behind them doing its ordinary, enormous thing, neither of them needing to say anything more about it. Clara met Patricia Gould, the Sterling Apex interim CEO, in the 4th month. She'd agreed to a single meeting at a coffee shop in Lower Manhattan. Her choice of location, her terms, made clear through attorneys in advance. She arrived 5 minutes early, which was her habit, and Patricia arrived exactly on time, which told Clara something about her. Patricia was 56, gray-haired, wore glasses she kept pushing up her nose at intervals that suggested she needed a better fit, and had the quality of someone who had survived a lot of corporate situations by being smarter than the room thought she was. Clara had read everything publicly available about her before the meeting. She appeared to be, as far as Clara could determine, a person of reasonable integrity who had found herself at the center of someone else's catastrophe and was trying to do something constructive with it. They ordered coffee. Patricia didn't do small talk, which Clara appreciated. She said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," Clara said, "the NextBridge technology is real. The underlying architecture, the research framework it was built on, is genuinely innovative. Our technology team has now done a full internal audit, and their assessment is that the core methodology is sound, and if the financial structure is rebuilt cleanly, potentially viable." "I know," Clara said. "I built it." Patricia looked at her steadily. "Yes. And that's what I want to talk about. Not ownership claims, not retrospective credit assignments. I understand from your attorney that you're not interested in that." "I'm not." "What I want to ask," Patricia said, "is whether you'd be willing to consult on the technical reassessment. Not for Sterling Apex. The company may or may not survive this in its current form, and that's not your problem. But there are 43 people on the technical team who built something real. And there are investors, small ones, not the institutional money that can absorb this, but actual individuals, who put money into something that might still be worth something if it's rebuilt honestly." She paused. "Your framework is the foundation. No one else can assess it from the inside the way you can." Clara held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table. She thought about Kay Tran, whom she'd never met, and the people like her, the ones who'd built the thing in good faith and were now living in the wreckage of someone else's choices. She thought about Leonard Hatch at his kitchen table for 14 months and what it costs a person to carry something they can't put down. "I'll consult on the technical assessment," Clara said, "not as a Sterling Apex employee or contractor. As an independent expert under my own name with my own terms. The engagement ends when the assessment ends. I don't want a stake in whatever comes next." "That's more than fair," Patricia said. "And the assessment is honest," Clara said. "If I find problems in the architecture beyond the financial manipulation, I report them. I don't clean anything up for a better outcome." "That's exactly what I need," Patricia said. They finished their coffee. It was not a warm meeting, but it was a useful one, which was more than Clara had expected, and exactly what she'd come for. The trial began in March, 7 months after the arrest. Clara did not attend the opening arguments. She watched a portion of the coverage online, in the apartment she'd moved into in Brooklyn 2 months earlier. Her own apartment, small and slightly underlit, and with a bathroom tile situation that needed addressing. But hers, lease in her name, furniture she'd chosen herself, books on shelves that she'd arranged without consulting anyone. She'd bought a lamp she liked. She'd put a plant on the kitchen windowsill that she was determined to keep alive, which so far she was managing imperfectly but adequately. She watched the coverage for about 40 minutes. She saw Adrian arrive at the courthouse, still in good suits, still with that held quality, though something in his bearing had shifted in the 7 months since the arrest, in a way that was visible if you'd spent 11 years studying the way he held himself. Something had gone out of it. Not humility, exactly. She doubted he was capable of humility in the genuine sense. More like the loss of the particular confidence that comes from believing you are, fundamentally, untouchable. He'd believed that for a long time. That belief was gone, and its absence was written in the set of his shoulders. She closed the laptop. She had work to do. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict came in on a Friday afternoon in late April. Guilty on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of securities manipulation, and 1 count of conspiracy in violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. The not guilty findings were on 2 subsidiary charges that the jury apparently found the documentation insufficient to support. Harlan had worked for those 2, and he'd gotten them, and it was the kind of partial victory that looks like nothing from the outside but represents a significant amount of professional effort. On the wire fraud and securities counts, the judge sentenced Adrian Sterling to 9 years in federal prison. The sentencing guidelines had suggested 7 to 12. She'd landed in the middle, which was where judges who've read everything carefully tend to land. She delivered the sentence in language that was measured and impersonal, and that contained in its final paragraph a single line that several journalists quoted in their coverage. The sophistication of this fraud was matched only by the apparent confidence of the defendant that the people closest to him were incapable of seeing it clearly. Adrian said nothing at sentencing. He'd been advised not to speak, and for once he'd followed the advice, sitting at the defense table with his hands flat in front of him, which was a posture Clara recognized. It was the posture he adopted when he was controlling something very carefully, when there was something he wanted to say that he understood would cost him more than staying quiet. She found out about the sentence from Marcus, who called her at 4:15 that afternoon. 9 years, he said. She was at her kitchen table in Brooklyn, working on the second section of the Sterling Apex technical assessment. The plan on the windowsill was doing better than expected. The tile situation in the bathroom remained unaddressed. "Okay," she said. "How are you?" She looked at the window. It was April, and the light was different from November, warmer and more angled, coming through the glass with the quality of a season that has decided to arrive. "I'm working," she said. "I'm okay." "You're allowed to feel something about this." "I know." She paused. "I think what I feel is tired, not the bad kind, the kind after something that took a long time." She thought about it. "And something else, not happy exactly, more like settled." "Settled's good," Marcus said. "Yeah," she said. "I think it is." She did not feel the need to visit Adrian in prison. She had considered it once, briefly, in an abstract way. The way you consider things that have a certain narrative logic to them. The confrontation, the final words. But the real version of it, when she imagined it practically, had no appeal. There was nothing she needed to say to him that she hadn't already said through the 47 audio recordings and 800 pages of documentation and the 9 months of careful, methodical work that had said everything more clearly than any conversation could. What she was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, was that closure is not a single event. It is a process, and it proceeds at its own pace regardless of external landmarks, arrests, verdicts, sentences. The landmark matters. The feeling doesn't follow on schedule. She talked about this with a therapist she'd started seeing in January, a woman named Dr. Audrey Weil, who worked from a small office in Park Slope and who had a direct manner that Clara appreciated, and a habit of asking the same question from different angles until the answer that came out was the one that was actually true rather than the one that was easiest to articulate. "Do you feel like it's over?" Dr. Weil asked her the week after the verdict. "Legally, mostly," Clara said. "There are still civil proceedings. The divorce is still in process. The consulting work goes until June." "That's not what I asked." Clara sat with it. The office was small and had a window that looked out onto a courtyard, and through it she could see a tree that had just started to leaf out, that particular tentative spring green that doesn't look real, but is. "It's not over," she said. "It won't be over in the way I think you're asking about for a while. Maybe a long while." She paused. "But I'm not waiting for it to be over. That's different from before. Before I was always waiting for something. Waiting for him to change, waiting for the right moment to do something, waiting for it to get better or different, or—" She stopped. "Now I'm just living, in the actual present, which sounds simple and isn't." "No," Dr. Weil said. "It isn't. The divorce was finalized in June, 8 months after the night of the gala. The settlement was negotiated through attorneys across multiple sessions over 4 months, complicated by the freeze on Adrian's assets and the ongoing federal proceedings. And the final agreement was not a triumph for either side in the clean narrative sense. It was a legal document that divided the remnants of a shared life with the imperfect precision of legal instruments, which is to say it addressed property and finances and obligations and said nothing at all about everything else. Clara kept the rights to her intellectual work, the NextBridge research framework, the methodology documentation, the foundational research that was now formally attributed to her in the Sterling Apex technical audit and in 2 subsequent filings with the SEC. She received a financial settlement that was reduced by the asset freeze, but that was sufficient, combined with her consulting income and the research work she was building, to constitute a life. Not the life she'd had in the penthouse, not the life of charity galas and custom dresses and a driver who knew where to go without being told. A different life. Smaller in some dimensions, larger in others. She signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning in her attorney's office, using a pen that belonged to the firm and that she set down afterward without ceremony. Her attorney said, "How are you feeling?" with the professional warmth of someone who has been through this moment with many people and understands it to be significant in ways that don't always show on the surface. Like myself, Clara said. Her attorney smiled. That's the best answer I've heard in a while. That summer, Rachel flew in from Portland with her husband and the 2 kids for a week. They stayed in a hotel nearby because Clara's apartment was genuinely too small for 4 additional humans, which was fine. She cooked a dinner for all of them 3 nights in a row at the small table that she'd extended with a leaf she'd found in the back of a closet, and the table was too crowded and one of Rachel's kids knocked over a glass of water on the second night, and there was a small crisis involving a wet tablecloth and insufficient paper towels. And they all ate slightly late, and the food was not exactly as good as she'd wanted it to be, and it was one of the best evenings she'd had in years. Rachel stayed after her husband took the kids back to the hotel on the 3rd night, washing dishes in Clara's small kitchen while Clara dried them, which was the kind of domestic companionship that they'd had as children, and that had persisted across all the years and differences and distances between them. "You look different," Rachel said. "I know." "Good different, not like you're performing anything." Clara thought about that. "I spent a long time performing," she said. "The wife version, the quiet version, even the revenge version in some ways. I was so focused on the plan that I was performing competence to myself." Rachel handed her a wet pot. "And now?" "Now I'm just a person," Clara said. "With a plant I'm keeping alive and a bathroom that needs new tile and work I actually care about." She dried the pot. "It's not dramatic." "No," Rachel said. "It's better than dramatic." Eat. In September, Clara submitted her first independent research paper to a peer-reviewed journal in the field of financial technology and algorithmic risk assessment. It was 42 pages long, extensively cited, and built entirely on methodology she had developed over the previous decade, methodology that had been, for most of that time, someone else's asset. The paper proposed a new framework for evaluating real-time risk in complex financial systems, with particular attention to the vulnerabilities created when financial architecture is optimized for appearance rather than accuracy. It was, in its way, everything she'd learned from being inside Adrian's world, translated into something that could actually protect people from the kind of damage that world had done. The journal accepted it with minor revisions. It was published in November, a year almost to the week from the night she'd walked out of the Meridian Grand and left her ring on a white linen tablecloth. She did not mark the anniversary in any formal way. She went to work. She took a walk in the late afternoon through the Brooklyn streets that were getting to be familiar to her in the way places get familiar when you live in them without planning an exit. The corner store, the park, the coffee shop where the barista had started making her order when she walked in the door because she'd been in enough mornings that he knew what she'd want. Small things. Repeated things. The texture of an ordinary life. She thought on that walk about what it means to be invisible inside someone else's story. She'd been Clara Sterling for 11 years, and Clara Sterling was a supporting character in Adrian's narrative. The wife, the background, the person who looked right and said little and was useful in the ways that didn't show. She'd been so thoroughly absorbed into his version of things that she'd almost lost the thread of her own version. Almost. What she understood now, in the way you understand something only after you've been through the full length of it, was that her invisibility had never been passive. It had been the thing she was doing while he wasn't watching. Every year she'd stayed, every piece of work she'd contributed without credit, every document she'd memorized, and every conversation she'd filed away. None of that was surrender. It was accumulation. It was the building of something that a man who only valued what he could see would never see coming. She didn't think of that as a strategy she'd consciously adopted from the beginning. She wasn't sure she'd been that deliberate, that far back. But looking at it now, she thought there was something worth holding on to in what it revealed. That the person in the room everyone overlooks is not necessarily the person with the least power. Sometimes they're the person who has decided where to put theirs. Adrian Sterling entered the Federal Correctional Facility in October. He was given a cell, a schedule, a set of rules that governed every hour of his day in ways that were the complete inversion of his previous life. He'd spent 20 years constructing an existence in which he controlled everything: time, money, information, people. The facility returned none of that. It gave him a bunk, a window, a certain number of outdoor hours, and the company of people who had no reason to be impressed by him and mostly weren't. He was not, by most accounts, the kind of prisoner who collapsed immediately. He was too controlled for that, too practiced at maintaining a surface. But the surface, over weeks and months, began to show the wear that surfaces show when there's nothing left propping them up from behind. The money was largely gone. Legal fees, asset forfeiture, the civil judgments that came after the criminal conviction. The company that bore his name was in the process of being restructured under a name that did not bear his name. The people who had surrounded him, who'd been part of the architecture of his public identity, had made the calculations that people make and moved on, with the exception of a few who visited occasionally and with decreasing frequency. He had time in that facility that he had never had before. Not unscheduled time. Everything was scheduled, but the inner kind, the kind that doesn't fill itself automatically with motion and transaction and performance. He didn't know, initially, what to do with it. He'd never had to figure that out. Slowly, in the way that slow things happen when there's nowhere to go, he began to think about things he hadn't thought about in a long time. Some of it was tactical. The appeal, the timeline, the calculations that men like him don't fully stop making. But some of it was other. The Sunday mornings with the burned toast, the moment he'd seen Clara across a room at a conference, years before they were anything to each other, and thought she was the most quietly interesting person he'd ever seen, meaning it genuinely, before he'd figured out how to turn that into something useful to him instead. He didn't arrive at remorse in any clean or conclusive way. That would be too simple, and he was a complicated person, and complicated people don't resolve. But there were hours, early morning hours, the particular quality of federal facility before 5 a.m., when the light through the window was the same gray as a November city, when he sat with what he'd done and what it had cost, not to him, but to other people, and found that he couldn't entirely redirect it away from himself the way he always had. He wrote a letter to Clara once, in the 3rd month. He didn't send it. He wrote 3 drafts and then folded the last one and put it in the drawer and didn't go back to it. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood. In a way, he'd come to understand things more clearly now that there was no buffer between him and understanding, that there was no version of that letter that served her in any way. She wasn't waiting for it. She didn't need it. Whatever it would have given him to send it, she had already moved well past any place where receiving it would have mattered. He left it in the drawer. The research paper Clara published in November was cited in 4 subsequent papers within 6 months of its publication. One of the citations came from a financial technology professor at a university whose name Clara had known for years, someone whose work she'd read throughout the Sterling Apex years, quietly and on her own time, building a conversation with ideas she hadn't been permitted to join publicly. The professor sent her an email. Short, collegial, specific about which section of her paper had been most useful to his own work. He asked if she'd be interested in contributing to a symposium he was organizing on algorithmic transparency in financial systems, coming up in the spring. She read the email 3 times. Not because it was complicated, it was a straightforward professional inquiry, but because it was the kind of email she'd spent 11 years watching arrive in other people's inboxes. The kind that assumes you belong at the table. The kind that is addressed to the person who did the work, rather than the person standing next to the person who did the work. She wrote back, "I'd be glad to contribute. What's the timeline?" She hit send. She sat back in her chair. Through the kitchen window, the plant on the sill had grown enough that she'd had to repot it the previous week into something bigger, which it appeared so far to be handling well. She looked at it for a moment with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite happiness, but was in the neighborhood of both. The feeling of a life that is becoming what it was supposed to be, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the real way, the gradual and imperfect and honest way, one day accumulated onto the next. There's a thing people say about the quiet ones, that you should watch out for them, that still waters run deep, that the person who says the least in the room is the one to pay attention to. It's the kind of thing people say as a warning or a witticism, not expecting it to be tested. Clara Voss had spent 11 years being the quiet one. She had used that quiet the way serious people use serious tools, carefully, purposefully, with full understanding of what it was for. The world had looked at her and seen a wife, a background, an accessory to someone else's ambition. It had not seen the 800 pages of documentation or the 47 audio files or the 9 months of patient, methodical building. It had not seen the person underneath the stillness, reading everything, remembering everything, waiting for exactly the right moment. She had not done any of it perfectly. She had made mistakes, things she'd trusted too long, things she'd said when she should have been quiet or stayed quiet when she should have said something. She had stayed 11 years in something she should have left sooner, and that truth didn't disappear because the ending was just. She had her own inventory to take, her own reckonings that weren't about Adrian, but she had also done something real. She had protected people she didn't know from a fraud that would have cost them things they couldn't afford to lose. She had given Leonard Hatch a door out of the room he'd been trapped in for 14 months. She had put her name on work that was hers, publicly and permanently, in a way that couldn't be absorbed or redirected or erased. She had built a life in Brooklyn with a plant on the windowsill and tile that still needed fixing, and a table that was too small for company, but that she kept anyway because she liked having people around it. She had taken back the thing that gets taken from people slowly, over time, in small increments that each seem manageable until you look up and realize how much is gone. She had taken back herself. That was not a small thing. That was not a thing to set aside in favor of the more dramatic parts of the story. In fact, if there was a lesson anywhere in the wreckage and the paper trail and the federal proceedings and the severed relationships and the borrowed kitchen in Astoria and the cold tea and the November light, if there was something worth keeping from all of it, it was that. The most important thing a person can do is to remain, in whatever conditions they find themselves, genuinely and stubbornly themselves. Not the version that other people find convenient, not the version that fits into someone else's story. Themselves. With all the difficulty and inconvenience and refusal to disappear that entails. Clara Voss had spent 11 years becoming almost invisible. She had spent the following year becoming quietly and without drama, entirely visible again. That was the story. That was the whole of it.